The NRL 22 October Course of Fire, this week on Mail Call Mondays. Mail Call Mondays is sponsored by Modular Driven Technologies. If you need a chassis system for your precision rifle, check out mdttac.com. I'm John McQuay with 8541 Tactical, and this is Mail Call Mondays, the show that answers your questions about precision rifles, optics, and equipment. Welcome to another Mail Call Mondays, and this Monday we are going to talk about the October Course of Fire for the National Rifle League 22 matches. This last weekend, this Saturday, we shot the October Course of Fire at the Westside Sportsman's Club here in Evansville, Indiana, and this was a really interesting course of fire, and it was very enjoyable. And we're going to talk about some of the different stages. There were 5 different stages, and we'll talk about some of the things I liked and some of the things that I disliked about it. First of all, the rifle in front of me, this is the configuration that I shot for the NRL 22 match this month. We are shooting a Victor Company Titan 1022 stock with the Victor Company cheek piece, a Harris BRMS 6-9 bipod. This is the SWFA SS 3 to 15 by 42 millimeter rifle scope. It is a first focal plane rifle scope, and we do have a Green Mountain barrel on here. We have a Kid trigger kit inside a standard Ruger trigger housing, standard Ruger bolt, and a Kid bolt handle. That is about the overall equipment that I used. 2 pieces of equipment that I found really useful for this course of fire. One is the Solo Sack from Short Action Precision. This is a heavyweight, medium-sized rear bag. It is actually filled with sand, and you can see when I drop it on the table, it sits upright. It's really an interesting deal. It's fairly heavyweight. I haven't actually weighed it, but it's got some heft to it. You're not going to want to throw this in the bottom of your pack if you're on a sniper challenge type match. But for anything where you really need a very stable rear bag or very stable support, this is a really great option, and I'll talk about how I used it here when we go over the courses of fire. The other piece of equipment that I found really useful was a WeBad pump pillow. So it is a medium-sized bag. It's about the largest bag that you can actually use for NRL 22 competition because their limit is the size of a volleyball or smaller, and they specifically allow the WeBad pump pillow. So that one I found very useful for some of the positional stages. And then finally, a good sling. You had to have a sling for it. This is a sling of my own design that we're still working on. I still haven't decided if we're actually going to bring this to market or not. But slings are really becoming a really required piece of equipment for the NRL 22 matches. You want to make sure you take a sling to those matches. So that was about the extent of the gear. Of course, I have my backpack full of my different support gear, but equipment that I actually needed to shoot the match, that was what I used. So you can see these NRL 22 matches, you can get into them and shoot them at a pretty high level with a minimum of equipment. So let's talk about the stages of fire real quick. The first stage of fire was the Spooky Tire of Death, and this one I liked a lot. Basically, the barricade that you're shooting off of was a tire stood up on its end, so you're shooting through the donut, and they used the stepladder to keep the tire upright. So you could tie the tire to the stepladder, keep it upright, and that was your firing position. You started behind the rifle, resting on the top of the tire, and on the start signal, you'd engage a 25-yard 1-inch target with 4 rounds. You then transitioned to the middle of the tire with the rifle resting on the tire's bead and shot the 25-yard 1-inch target with 4 rounds. Then you moved to prone and shot the 25-yard 0.25-inch target with the remaining rounds. So there, basically, you had the KYL rack sitting out there, and you started on the top of the tire, then you moved to the center of the tire, and you couldn't, even if you had a bipod that was long enough, you could not shoot with your bipod touching the ground through the center of the tire. The rifle had to be resting on the tire's bead, and then of course you went prone. So fairly easy stage. The time limit for this was 120 seconds, so the time limit was 2 minutes on it, and of course the round count was 10, and that's pretty standard for the NRL matches. Each stage is a 10 round, that way there's no magazine changes, and a standard magazine will be able to get you. But with 2 minutes, even if you were limited, say you were shooting a Savage Mark II with 5-round magazines, you have plenty of time for a magazine change in there. So I really like this one. It was a straightforward stage. You just had to move the barricade. Now the one really tricky part was, although the tire was secured to the ladder so the tire wasn't just going to flop over, there was a little bit of give in it, which I noticed when I initially loaded the tire. And if you pushed hard enough, you obviously could flip the whole thing over. So you had to come to that intermediate level of tension against the tire and getting a stable shooting position. The center of the target, or center of the tire, was fine, and prone was fine. This is where the pump pillow came in, because the top of the tire was high enough that if I had my strong side knee up, I still had some room between it, so I needed that pump pillow to get a nice stable position and anchor that firing side arm in. And then I was able to, I think I went prone for shooting through the bead, because that ended up being kind of a high prone and then a regular prone for shooting the prone bipod stage next to it. And the way the A-frame of the ladder ended up, you had space between the tire and the ladder, and most guys shot between that space instead of trying to slide out to the side. That way you saved a little bit of time. A really fun stage. But I'll give you guys a little tip for that KYL rack. When you get to that 0.25 inch spinner, that guy really is, it's really narrow, but it's really tall. So don't try to shoot it right down there at the tip. Come up a little bit. That way, if your elevation is off a little, you're still going to hit the spinner and you're still going to whip that guy around. You don't want to aim right down at the tip, because if you drop a little bit low, you go under and it's a miss. So most guys have figured out to come up a little bit higher on that spinner and hit it. That way you've got a little bit more meat, because you don't lose any width going higher up on the spinner. Now, if you switch over to like the 1 inch one, you want to try to center up on that 1 inch circle, because if you go high, then you lose your windage side to side. You lose some meat there. So just a little bit of a tip on the really tiny one. Hold a little bit high on it, and you'll have a little bit more leeway if you're not very stable up and down. So really fun stage. I really enjoyed that one. We went through it pretty quickly. The next stage was the scary cinder blocks from hell. This one was shooter would start with rifle resting on one cinder block. On the start signal, shooter will engage the 100-yard target with 3 rounds, and this was a 5-inch hanging target. So 100-yard target with 3 rounds. Shooter will leave their rifle, move 10 yards behind the firing line to retrieve a second block and bring it back to the firing line, stack it on top of the first block, and shooter will then fire 3 rounds at the 100-yard target from the top of the second block. Shooter will repeat this process for the third block and fire the remaining 4 rounds from the top of the third block. So there was a little bit of flexibility in how you executed this. So you had your first block starting on your side, horizontal, so the block was wide and short. So you started from this position. I shot this prone for the first block. You fire it, you set your rifle aside, and I set my rifle aside and I dropped the solo sack right in front of it. So I grabbed the next cinder block, and we didn't have 10 yards forward and back to work with, so we went 10 yards to the side to grab the cinder block and bring it back. Same distance, you just went to the side instead of retreating. Grab the next cinder block, come up, and I set it horizontally, so I'm still as low as I can possibly go stacking these blocks. Drop the sack back on top, threw the rifle on top, and this solo sack, when you drop the rifle down and get it really edged in there, it's very stable. I could almost free recoil the rifle and be just fine. I haven't had time to work with free recoil a lot. I'm still not the greatest at it, so if I can load the rifle, then I still prefer to do that. But the sack really allowed me to get a nice stable position. So I shot that, and that one I believe I went low kneeling, and then I believe I went high kneeling for the next block. There really wasn't any craziness to it. There wasn't really any tricks to this one. Although if you decided that you couldn't get low enough for whatever reason and you wanted a higher position, you could set one of those blocks vertical and then shoot off the vertical. I did actually see one guy do that for the second block, but the problem is it does eat up some of your time, because then when you bring the next block over, you have to set that block down and then stack the next one up, and you start to juggle around these blocks. The target is 5 inches at 100 yards. That's a really meaty target for the precision that these rifles are capable of. So as long as you drop down in there and you got a nice stable position, you were good to go. Now I had to make the decision on the solo sack or the pump pillow, which one I thought would benefit me the most, because you can only use one bag. So I went with the solo sack because I figured I wanted to get that nice stable position on the blocks, and if I could get stable on the blocks, then my strong side arm wasn't going to be wagging around a whole lot in empty space. And that ended up working fine. I believe I actually cleaned that stage. And again, you had 2 minutes to complete the stage, so plenty of time. I did get my heart rate and breathing up a little bit because I was trying to not expend any extra time that I didn't need to when I was stacking the blocks. I would prefer to spend that time on the gun getting settled in than moving between the blocks. But it is kind of a balancing act. How fast do you want to move moving concrete blocks versus how jacked up do you want your breathing when you actually have to get down and break the shot. So you don't want to sprint, but you don't want to spend too much extra time moving between positions. The next stage was called Horrifying Holdovers, and the ranges and targets were 50 yards with a .75 inch and .5 inch hanging targets, 75 yards with a 2.5 inch and 1 inch hanging target, and a double hanger that was on a double hanger, and 100 yards for a 3 inch hanging target. 2 minutes, 10 rounds. On the start signal, the shooter will engage the .75 inch target at 50 yards with 2 rounds. Hit or miss, move to engage the 2.5 inch target at 75 yards and engage with 2 rounds. Move to engage the 3 inch target at 100 yards with 2 rounds. Then the .5 inch target at 50 yards with 2 rounds, and finally the 1 inch target at 75 yards with 2 rounds. You could not dial, you had to use holdovers in your scope. So again, we see that you really need a MIL or MOA reticle in your scope for this type of competition. This one had you starting at 50, then 75, then 100, and then back to 50, and then to 75. So 50, 75, 100, 50, 75. So you had to get your holdovers down in your head. I'm zeroed at 50, so I just had to remember my 75 and my 100 dope. So I was 1 mil for 75 and 1.9 mils for 100. So pretty easy to skip between those. This one was easy to get lost on what target you should be shooting on, so you had to make sure you kept track. I believe we were shooting left target, then top target, then the single gong, and then right target and bottom target. Or yeah, you see I'm getting mixed up even remembering it here. So you had to make sure that you were shooting on the right target, but other than that, it wasn't too terrible. The thing that we did notice on these is you have to be careful with the target stands, because we were working with wet ground, and so occasionally we would shoot the target stands loose and they would fall over. So you want to make sure that you plant those guys in and make sure that even if they wiggle around a little bit, they're not going to fall over, because that steel flapping around, we'll loosen them up, and then when they get top heavy, they just go. So bear that in mind. Really was not a difficult stage. It was all shot from prone, so it's fairly straightforward. Again, you just wanted to make sure you had a rifle scope, that you were confident in the holdovers, and you were able to utilize that reticle to get your hits. Again, 2 minutes. In 2 minutes using holdovers instead of dialing, you had plenty of time. The next stage was a paper stage, and this one you actually had 90 seconds on. It's called the Great Pumpkin. And it was on the start signal. A shooter will engage the top 2-inch 50-yard paper target with 3 rounds from strong side. Shooter will then engage the second from the top target with 2 rounds from the support side. The shooter will then engage the third from the top with 3 rounds from the strong side, and the shooter will engage the bottommost target with 2 rounds from the support side. Again, this is all at 50 yards, so most of us were just shooting at our 0 range, and you started from your strong side prone, you fired your 3 rounds, and you switched to the support side, 2 rounds, strong side, 3 rounds, support side, 2 rounds, going on a new target each time you switch sides. This time we actually didn't have any problems with people shooting on the wrong target. So that was really nice. I think guys have gotten down to the point where they know to check the target number before you engage. And it wasn't a big deal at all. Now, I did actually blow this stage. I had a malfunction and caused me to drop 2 rounds. It's the first time I've actually had a malfunction in competition with this rifle, and I'm not entirely sure what it was. I still haven't had a chance to strip it apart and clean the bolt, but what I think I had was a hang fire. So I fired my round, I got a click, and as I went up to run the bolt to cycle a new round in, as I got my hand up, the rifle fired and ejected a spent case into my hand. So it ejected it into my firing hand, so I know I didn't hook the trigger while I was going up for immediate action. But it kind of threw me off a little bit, and I had already programmed in my head to go ahead and do immediate action, so even after I had that, I racked the bolt, which kicked out then a live round. So I went through and finished my string of fire, but I was 2 rounds short at the end, and I didn't bring a spare magazine up to the line with me. I had gotten complacent, and the rifle had been working really well, so I hadn't been loading up a second magazine and bringing it to the line with me. That's something I probably will change in the future. What I've seen guys do before, and what I will probably start doing on the rifle, is if we're in a static position like that, I've seen guys put Velcro on the side of the rifle and then just put Velcro on the bottom of the 10-22 magazine since they're wide and flat, and then just Velcro a 10-22 magazine onto the side of the rifle. So that way it's there. If you need it, you can dump it, do a quick reload, and you're good to go. So that's something I'm going to consider doing from now on, making sure I have a loaded magazine, spare magazine when I go up, and that I can quickly get it into action. It's not like when we do centerfire rifles where I can have a round holder on the side to throw rounds in. 22s are just too small to be able to do that without fumbling them, especially if I'm wearing gloves, which I was through a lot of these stages of fire. So I had some issues on that, dropped some points, and that knocked me out of the top running and put me down towards a 3rd place finish for this match. But it was a learning experience. Now, what it sounded like to me is that was probably a hang fire. I don't know if I have some nastiness in the bolt or if it was just a bad round and I got a good firing pin hit on it, but it took a few minutes for it to light off. It wasn't overly cold. We were working with about 40-degree temperatures, but to be honest, I am not used to shooting 22s in those kind of temperatures. Usually my 22s are warm summer day rifles, so I don't know. We'll have to see when we go into the really cold temperatures if I continue to have problems. And I was shooting Wolf Match Target, which is very high quality ammunition. So at this point, I don't know, but it's something I'm going to keep track of going forward. I've never had a hang fire with this rifle before, but it shows you that safety always has to be paramount in your mind. I had a malfunction, but I kept the muzzle oriented downrange when I went to clear it, and it was no problem. The round went downrange. In fact, we think the round struck the target board, thankfully, on a target that was not being used by a shooter. We found it downrange later on, a clean target where we didn't have a shooter for that target, and we had a 22 hole in it. So I think that's what happened on that. But again, paper stage, fairly straightforward. The scoring ring for 100 points or 10 points on this was the dead center of the pumpkin, and it was about the size of a nickel or maybe between a nickel and a dime. So it was a fairly small scoring target, but most of the rifles that we're shooting have the capability to just center punch that. And that's why dropping those 2 points on that stage just really, really killed me because that should have been a really easy point stage. And the next stage after that was Unsupported and Unskeered. And this was our sling stage. And the targets were a 1.5-inch target at 25 yards, a 2-inch target at 50 yards, and a 6-inch target at 100 yards. On the start signal, the shooter will engage the 1.5-yard, 25-yard target with 3 rounds from prone with only a sling as support. The shooter will then engage the 2-inch 50-yard target with 3 rounds, and finally the shooter will engage the 6-inch 100-yard target with 4 rounds. A note on here is the sling was the only equipment you were allowed to use. No part of the rifle could touch the ground, and Hawkins prone was not allowed, and that's using your fist to support the front of the rifle while your fist is on the ground, so kind of using your fist as a monopod. This is where sling was really, really necessary, and what I like about this stage and what I like about what the NRL is doing is a lot of guys that don't use slings are now being forced to find out how to properly utilize a shooting sling. Most shooters just believe a sling is for carrying your rifle while you're out hunting or moving around on the range. A lot of shooters do not know how to use a sling. Now, you don't have to have a really fancy shooting sling. You can use just a regular carry strap as long as you have the sling adjusted to the appropriate length for you. Then you can use a hasty sling, and we'll get into some sling use videos a little bit later on this year. It's definitely something that I want to show you guys. It's fairly easy, but it feels really funky the first couple of times you do it, and especially when you're getting down into that prone position, there's some tricks to getting slung up and getting a really tight slung position when you're in the prone position. But if you have a standard shooting sling that you can adjust the length, a regular web sling, you can get it adjusted correct, and you can just do a hasty sling, and that's where you stick your arm through the sling, wrap it back under, and then grab the fore end of your rifle. So the sling is basically making an S-curve through your arm, and when you pull that arm back in, it will tighten that sling against you and really anchor that rifle down into your shoulder and down into your support hand. So it all works really, really well when you learn to do it. Now, what was tricky on this stage is the targets were kind of offset from us on our range, so you really had to move your natural point of aim between each target. So you had to shift your whole body because when you're slung up, you can't just swing. If you have that muscular tension when you fire, then you'll tend to swing back off target. So you have to move your whole body so you maintain that natural point of aim on each one of the targets. You had 2 minutes to fire 10 rounds on 3 different targets, so the time really wasn't a bad thing. Overall, this was really, really fun. I did drop, I think, 1 or 2 shots on this. Wasn't really happy with that because I know I can shoot better than that, but I was a little bit rusty shooting from a sling from the prone position because I get so used to going out and shooting from the bipod. So I'm going to have to get out and practice more with the sling. But that was a great time. Not really all that challenging if you're used to the sling. If you're not used to the sling, it was very challenging for some shooters. And that was the last stage. As I said, there were 5 stages. A really fun overall course of fire. I can't begin to tell you how much I am enjoying shooting NRL 22 because it is really easy. It's quick to set up for guys. You show up out there, you get your stuff done. We had 12 or 13 shooters, I think, for this match. I kind of expected that because we're starting to get into our cold weather, and a lot of our fair weather shooters stop coming out for matches when it gets pretty cold. As we go into the winter, I hope we keep those numbers or bump them up a little bit, but we'll see how things go. The equipment, if you come out and shoot base class, you don't have a huge equipment investment. I'm seeing guys that are coming out with 10-22 carbines with $100 scopes on them, and they're shooting the match and they're having a ton of fun. So I don't want the equipment to limit anybody from coming out and shooting these things. it's a great time. I'll be really interested to see as we go forward and as we get into the next season how the rules change. My hope is that we actually have a hard MSRP cap for the base class, because I think we really need to keep that base class price low to get new shooters in and get them competitive in their class. I don't really want to get to a point where, you know, a guy can kind of sneak a $2,000 to $3,000 rig into base class because he's exercising that loophole that we've talked about before. So I don't know. We'll see where we're going forward. I totally understand that to get the NRL 22 off the ground, we had to start somewhere at the rules, and the guys that put the rules together understood that this was going to kind of be a trial, and we were going to tweak the rules after this. So we'll see going forward, but I'm pretty happy with the rifle as it is so far. I've got a few little things that I have to tweak on it, and I'm learning this system as I go. I haven't changed a whole lot since the last match I shot, other than swapping the stock from the Bell & Carlson to the Titan 1022. I will probably stick with this stock for a little while, but Macmillan has released their A522. So you can go on Macmillan's site and check that guy out, and it is basically the same configuration as the Macmillan A5 stock, but it is inletted for the Ruger 1022. So that is really interesting. I've already talked to Macmillan about it, and hopefully we will have one of those in soon to be able to use. But those of you guys that have ordered from Macmillan know that that is not a very fast process. Sometimes there's a bit of a wait time to get a Macmillan stock in. On the centerfire side of things, we've got a couple of things showing up. We are wrapping up the Modular Driven Technologies ESS review. I know you guys have really been waiting for this. I've really been waiting to get it out to you. We had a couple of things that put us back a little bit on it. I actually shot the whole review. There were some things that I weren't happy with on it, so I went back and changed some things. But I'm hoping by the end of this week, I will have that ESS review out for you guys. I've absolutely loved shooting that thing so far. It's a great chassis system overall, but like anything, there are pros and there are cons to it, and I'm interested in actually talking to you about those and letting you know if it's something that may work for your specific situation. In addition to that, we have a Kinetic Research Group Bravo chassis that is inbound right now. And we also have an XLR Envy chassis that should be coming in. So those will be something that you'll be seeing going forward. So that's our current state of affairs. And I really want to know from you guys, are you guys enjoying the 22 rimfire content? Is it a little too much? Is it something you're not interested in? Please post in the comments section down below, or send us a comment on Facebook or Twitter and let me know how you feel about the 22 comment. Obviously, I want to produce content that you guys enjoy. So if this stuff is boring you, then we'll figure out something else to go to. But it's something that has really excited me. I am really enjoying getting the rimfire rifles out and shooting them. For me, it is just an absolute blast. Once I get a good lock on what is working and how things are going, I am probably going to build up a rifle for my 15-year-old so that I can take him out and get him into this stuff too. So that's kind of where I'm at on it. And that's all for this Mail Call Mondays. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I really want to thank my Patreon supporters for helping to support the show. If you guys want to know more about Patreon, we will leave a link down below. If you have any questions or comments over anything we've covered on the show, you can leave them in the comments section down below or send them to us on Facebook or Twitter. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast app, you can send us questions at 8541tactical@gmail.com. If you like the show, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, get out and shoot.